Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all attendees worldwide, and a warm welcome to our speakers for this Daring Cities session. My name is Anina Hartung, and I am an officer in the Resilient Development Team at ICLE World Secretariat. In line with the theme of this year's Daring Cities, a just and equitable climate emergency response, I have the pleasure of facilitating today's session that is titled, Who Gets What in a Climate Disaster? Insights from Gender-Smart Climate and Disaster Risk Financing in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before we start, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items. As you can see, you have been automatically muted. However, you will still have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing them into the Q&A box in Zoom. And you can send your questions at any time, and we'll collect these at the end and address them during the Q&A part of the session. We also want to inform you that this event will be recorded, and the recording will be shared on the Daring Cities website to rewatch later. This is to ensure that interested experts in different time zones or those with conflicting commitments could also benefit from the insights of today's session. We also are happy to say that we have interpretation for our Spanish and Portuguese speaking audience, and you can find the button in the lower part of Zoom under interpretation. If you click on this button, you will see the available options and can listen in either English, Spanish, or Portuguese. The participants who do not select a channel will hear what we call the floor language, which is to say whichever language is being actively spoken at that time. So unless you are comfortable in all three languages, we would like to ask our audience to choose a language now at this time. Next slide, please. As we gather here today, the world faces a challenging reality, one where the consequences of climate change are not only imminent, but alarming. In this context, the demand for robust mechanisms and innovative financial instruments for disaster risk management have never been more pressing. And as we delve into these critical issues, we recognize that certain regions, particularly Latin America and the Caribbean, bear the brunt of climate-related disasters. These events not only disrupt lives, but disproportionately affect an often overlooked but crucial dimension, which is gender. In line with this, the distribution of resources in the aftermath of disaster are intertwined with gender norms and power dynamics, thereby shaping the trajectory of recovery. The evidence is clear that an equitable path lies forward in embracing a gender-sensitive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance CDRFI approach, which acknowledges the gender differential vulnerabilities to climate change and disasters between people of different genders due to the dynamics of socially constructed behaviors, norms, and relationships. As the world grapples with these challenges, local and regional governments driven by an increasing awareness of these disparities, emerge as pivotal actors in addressing inclusivity and effective decision-making for disaster risk management. However, translating this interest into concrete actions requires more than just a desire for change. It necessitates the right tools, the right resources, and the right mindset to determine an appropriate starting point. And that is what today's session intends to do. The next slide, please. We will first hear from a city representative in Latin America who is addressing this discrepancy before moving on to the next part of our session, which will uncover the three pillars of ADD. That is to say, the significance of raising awareness, leveraging crucial data, and issuing essential directives to incorporate gender considerations into the programs and policies for climate and disaster risk finance and insurance. And for this portion of the session, we're delighted to have three experts that will speak to each of these pillars. Then, last but not least, our final speaker will present a case example of an ICLE project in Latin America and the Caribbean that is implementing gender considerations into its work. By the end of this session, our local and regional governments will gain practical insights and invaluable tools to integrate gender considerations seamlessly into their climate risk finance endeavors, turning interest into action-oriented solutions. But before we hear from our speakers, we would actually like to take this opportunity now to hear from you using a Slido poll. We'll be asking two questions just to pick your brain. and understand how our audience considers gender-responsive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, you can either scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or you can go to slido.com and enter the 7-digit number that you see there. And the first question that we are asking is, what do you think is the biggest challenge for local governments implementing gender-responsive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance? And we're asking for just one word that pops into your mind. And for this, we would just like to take a few moments for our audience to first go onto Slido and answer the question. Okay, starting to see some answers trickling in. We have representation, we have equity. Oh, representation's a big one. So is data and awareness, of course. Financing, yes. Priorities, understanding, accurate data, know-how. Okay, these are all really, really great responses. So thank you already to everyone who has responded. Fortunately, we have to move quickly along to our next question, which is, what do you consider a key benefit for local governments regarding gender-responsive climate and disaster risk finance and insurance? And again, for this, we would ask one word that comes to mind. See protection, a quick recovery, resilience, livelihood, better security, stability, equity, once again. Okay, excellent. So these are all wonderful responses. Once again, thank you, everyone. And I wish that we could stick around and see more of your responses, but we do need to continue along and move forward with today's presentations. So going back to our slide deck now, on that note, I am very honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Maria Eduarda Campos. Maria Eduarda is a graduate in architecture and urbanism from the Federal University of Pernambuco, in administration from that same university, and with specialization in urban and environmental law from PUC in Minas Gerais. She was Secretary of Housing for the municipality of Recife from 2021 to March 2023, and she currently acts as the coordinator of innovation, risks, and housing policies at the Management Office of Promorar Recife, Brazil. Maria Eduarda will set the stage for today's session by inspiring us with an example of what a city from Latin America and the Caribbean region is doing to include gender-smart planning and policies in their local government. In this particular case, what Recife in Brazil is doing to foster gender-responsive urban development and ensure equitable access to resources and opportunities for all of its residents. Maria Eduarda, the floor is yours.
Obrigada. Primeiramente, gostaria de agradecer.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to talk about my city, about Recife, and about this program that we are creating in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank called Promorar, and it's a program of qualification and resilience in vulnerability areas of social environmental vulnerability areas in Recife. We brought this image to locate the city. So within Latin America and the country, it's one of the points that is closer to the African continent and also Europe. So 500 years ago, we had a colonization by the Portuguese, and Recife, especially, we also had a Dutch period during 15 years. The Dutch period lasted, and that had several impacts in the issue of urbanization and construction. Several bridges were built. So we have in the city this characteristic because it's an area that was born from a port area. So we have a population of 1.5 million inhabitants in 280 square kilometers. So it's the densest capital in the country, and it's one of the cities in the world that is most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's important to highlight that 61% of the houses are located in social interest communities in the poorest areas of the country. And we have a housing deficit of 70,000 houses. So I bring you these two images to show how the city has a lot of contrast between plains and hills. These pictures show the density and the vulnerability and the precariousness of the houses of several families. But also, we have a city that we call a city of contrast because we have a historical heritage that is very rich, architectural and landscape heritage. This is the Mark Zero, where the city was born, the square in the big picture. And this shows that the social interest areas are in all neighborhoods of the city, not only in the outskirts, but in the noble areas also. And this is a reflection of a decision that was made 40 years ago in our master plan, in our urban legislation, that was to protect these communities. And we decided to call them ZEs, special zones of social interest, and other cities in the country copied that. This was a way that we found 40 years ago to fight gentrification in our city.
Algumas imagens sobre a desigualdade. Então, nessa
I'll
proximidade,
talk about inequality. So in Recife, we have this characteristic of these houses on the river that we are trying to combat this type of homes that are very precarious and to bring also, I want to say about the Gini index for Recife. If Brazil in the last edition reached 0.49, the city of Recife is much more unequal than Brazil. It's almost at 0.7, just like several countries that still need to develop in this social area. So we have a mission in this new program to combat this inequality, and we are going to show what we're trying to do here.
comunidade de interesse social, a gente tem mapeadas desde
In the
2014.
social interest communities, we have mapped since 2014 545 communities. So these are some pictures from these communities. And we have a milestone that happened, a climate disaster last year in May. We had, it was called East Wave. So in 1 week, we had more than double of the forecasted in terms of rain in a single month. So we had more than 50,000 houses impacted. We had landslides and floods in other areas. And we had more than 3,500 people left without homes. So we had to pay around $600 to each family as a emergency support stipend. And we also spent more than expected to protect the hills, and we had to multiply by 5 the resources that we used to spend in this. These are some of what appeared in the news, international news, about this disaster that happened in the Recife last year. And here are some pictures of what happened in our city. So we were already talking in discussions with the Inter-American Bank to requalify vulnerable areas. It was actually integrated urbanization of all these areas, but we had to include an important component of resilience in the program after this event of last year. So, Promorar Recife program was born. It will last for 6 years. We signed an agreement in May of this year for $250 million, and it's a program considered a very fast program. In 1 year, we were able to structure this fundraising, and this program will focus strongly in resilience.
Os objetivos principais são melhorar as condições de habitabilidade em nossa
The main
cidade,
objectives are to improve the habitation conditions and quality of life, and especially in the vulnerable areas, and we are calling it social environmental vulnerability, not only social, but also these riverine communities close to the rivers and also in hills. And within the specific objectives are to urbanize these areas and to reduce the risk of landslides and flooding, but also to combat the housing deficit that is very significant in our city. The structuring of the program is along 3 axes. So we have the first one of urbanization that we intend to act in 40 communities, a second component of resilient infrastructure that we are going to develop in the basin of a river called Tejipio. So with studies and drainage and solutions for flooding areas, among others. And component 3 is the component that I coordinate, is the component of prevention. So it talks about innovation in housing policies and also fighting climate risk. We brought here some of the objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals, the main ones that we are addressing in the program, but we intend to address other ones as well. And we could not leave out social participation. So we created a structure and we already started the social communication by listening to some of the communities that have joined the program already at a first moment with approximation and co-creation. So we are opening workshops by groups for example, for women and for children. And I'll show you some pictures of this. And the projects are being discussed. First, we are raising the needs of each community, and after the engineering and architecture team will develop the project. So those are workshops that we developed this year with women. And here, speaking about prevention, so we are allocating resources for 3 systems: a system of management and monitoring of climate risk by purchasing several equipment, and we implemented this year a center of operations that has already started to work, and in the rains on the winter this year it was already working, and it was very important to have this integration among the different agencies and entities, the federal and the state levels. We are going to create also a data management system for urban control and an automated system for urban control. This is the most challenging one, and we are starting studies to find out what is the best way to do it for Recife. Now we're going to talk about gender equality. So in our master plan, urban master plan, it has as principles sustainable development, the social environmental function of the city, and also the land ownership, and also brings as a highlight the search for gender equality. So it's important to highlight this perspective, this different way that men and women experience the city. So a space that can be safe for a man, maybe a woman will not feel safe in that place. So we know that in the architecture and urban projects that we are developing, and even infrastructure, we must combat this inequality. And we are now doing this moment of listening. So we are going to women in each neighborhood and community. We do walks with them during the day and during the night to understand the space, land space, to understand how we can better allocate resources within this program. And another article in this same master plan, we talk about the gender perspective in formulating programs and policies of housing provision. Sorry for that. So, considering the gender perspective in our environmental legislation and urban legislation, it includes that. So we are working with giving title of the land and the house for women, or we've been working for several years in our city to prefer to give ownership of these property to women. In the beginning of the program in May, we created a work group of the Promorar program, which will be focused on gender and diversity, because we understand that this is an agenda that is transversal to all aspects of the program and to all actions. And because we think this is so important, we use this as a results indicator of the program with the bank, with the financial agent. So we'll be measured and evaluated according to the indicators of gender and diversity that we present. So, and also proposals of urban design that will do this intersectionality between gender and early childhood. We are also starting with Promorar, a program of social rentals. We already have a tender to hire a management company for this program, but it's a renting voucher. We want to offer this as a housing solution. So through this voucher policy, we are also placing these contracts preferably on the name of women's and also families with children and elderly women. And we're also innovating in giving priority to women in situations of domestic violence.
Maria Eduarda, so sorry to interrupt you, but could you kindly begin wrapping up your presentation?
Sim, estamos no penúltimo slide, obrigada. Serão nesses cursos.
All right, it's one before the last. So 1,000 women will be included in this program of productive inclusion, and we intend to advance in entrepreneurship and also civil construction with programs, courses specific for women. This is the final slide. And lastly, we want to talk about specific courses for the city defense, civil defense. So we have several women that were trained in this, and in the next few years, we want to train another 500 women as community leaders. And I also want to talk, Empodera Clima said in 2021 that Brazilian cities that want to be resilient to climate cannot ignore the gender aspect. So we know that in our city, the climate inequality is mainly impacts women, and in Recife also race is a component. So for Black women, we have data that they are more vulnerable. Thank you. In the next slide, I have the website of the program if you would like to access it.
Com isso, finalizo a apresentação. Obrigada.
Thank you very much, Maria Eduarda, for your inspiring presentation. I believe it really sets the scene for this session today. It was very fascinating to find out more about the city of Recife and the challenges being faced relating to urban density and precarity, and how you're responding to them. It's very clear that you have already had to face the impact of increasing natural disasters due to climate change, and then you have identified the need for resilience. And in only 1 year, constructed the fundraising for the comprehensive Promorar program. We all know that data availability is a significant challenge, and it was very inspiring to hear about your exercise of mapping out 545 communities to better gain a better understanding of local precarity. Representation was a key theme brought forward during the Slido exercise, and so it was very reassuring to hear about the co-creation process that you have pioneered with women and children through the program. And considering the gender perspective underlies many aspects of the program, and the ownership of property is definitely a crucial step towards empowerment, security, and resilience. So setting a KPI related gender and diversity ensures its prioritization. It was clearly a very inspiring presentation that touches upon many of the key areas of this session, and I would very much like to thank you for presenting a tangible example that we can surely build upon, and we wish you all the best for the successful implementation of the next phase of this project, especially the innovation and climate mitigation aspects. And now we do turn to our next section of our presentations today. We'll be discussing the 3 pillars of what we consider important for implementing gender considerations into climate and disaster risk finance and insurance for local governments. The first of these is the awareness pillar. And for this pillar, we ask the question, why is capacity building, raising awareness, and public buy-in necessary? What are the gaps, and what are the solution-oriented approaches? And to answer this question, we look to our next presenter, Leticia Gonçalves. And Leticia is a Brazilian risk finance expert, boasting 2 decades of experience in the insurance sector, and over a decade dedicated to inclusive and responsive insurance with a strong focus on gender and women's economic empowerment. Leticia is completing her doctorate in territory risk and public policies from the University of Coimbra in Portugal. And since June 2020, Leticia has been supporting the Regional Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean within the World Food Programme. In this role, she works with regional offices in the implementation of a comprehensive disaster risk financing instrument, CDRFI, solutions. And her academic accomplishments include a law degree from UNIFEMM Set Lagoas in Brazil, a specialization in strategic business management from UFMG, and a master's degree in peace studies, development, and conflict transformation from the University of Innsbruck in Austria. Leticia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anina. Thank you so much for the introduction. I don't know if you can move the slides, please. Yeah. Bueno, entonces, un placer hablar a todos. Voy a hablar español para tener un poco equidad en las presentaciones. Solo una breve introducción, no sé si, if the next slide, please. Una introducción para resaltar un poco como el PMA o el WFP.
I'll speak in Spanish, so I would like to show how WFP incorporates this insurance to consider the frequency and the intensity and this parametric insurance that is fundamental for WFP, both in micro, medium, and macro levels. So I will present a few examples because insurance are a tool. They do not solve all the programs, but they are a very important tool when we're talking about resilience. Next slide. I will present an example of Nicaragua. The example of Nicaragua is very interesting because we have the macro insurance and at the same time we have a micro insurance that actually we're going to do a pilot as meso. So this focus by levels is very important. As WFP, we have been learning a lot, but yes, it's very important to have the adhesion of the government and the internal capacitation of the country. And currently, these programs are being expanded in Nicaragua. So here we can see that we have a macro policy that we started as a pilot in 2022, but we also have a micro insurance that we started in 2021, which is a small pilot that we do with associations and cooperatives with a very strong focus on gender. but we are expanding, and this year we will start with a parametric insurance at the meso level, at cooperative level. So this is a way that we are seeking to include the municipalities, because we have interesting examples in Guatemala. So here I'm going to explain a little bit how it works, our macro approach. As a PMA, what we do, the WFP, we provide a support to the government, which is a pool in the Latin America, and with this top up, it generates an increment to the policies. So if there is an event, a covered event, this government receives a payment. And the example that we have in Nicaragua, the government pays a proportional amount to the increment, to the funding. So we have this is a way that we have to increase the support after the climate event. So Nicaragua was the first country in Central America to sign this CDRFI, because before we had just one country, and since 2016, Nicaragua already has a policy for this, insurance policy. So lots of people could ask why we're working with the government, but we think that these solutions are a way that we have to reach the communities of vulnerable people with pre-established funding, which is what we said in the beginning. How can we react quickly to these events and then reach the people who are impacted? Here we have a scheme or a diagram of how we work. This year we included a very interesting element, which is to reserve here in this first block a part of the payout. So if we have a payment for insurance, part of that will go to climate systems, emergency agencies, so on, so that they can recover quickly to give responses and to generate data. This is an agreement that we did with the government of Nicaragua, because if there is a payment, this will go back to them in this way. And we have also an exchange between agencies. This was very important. We work not only with the Ministry of Economy, but also with other agents of the government to discuss the plan of response in case of a climate event, which was the case that happened with the hurricane. Here we're going to see what happened. We signed this agreement for this insurance policy with the government in May, because the government is the holder of this policies COGRIFs. So, and the climate event was in October, and this generated 9 million in payment to the government. And how was this implemented? So it was implemented in several phases. In the first moment, we increased or implemented in school meals, because this is a very important role that the WFP has. So during 60 days, we doubled the school meals for children. We provided one extra meal that they could take home, that could be used by their parents and siblings as well. After that, we worked with trees that are destroyed, so we replanted trees, and we started vegetable gardens in schools. We also had a cash transfers to support a reactivation or recovery of the economy, because everybody were impacted by the hurricane. And we also reserved $70,000 as a provision to renew the policy of this year. So now, speaking quickly about the micro insurance, we work with communities, especially cooperatives of farmers, because we work, the WFP works with farmers. So we were thinking how to support them so that they can continue to advance with resilience after these events take place. And it's interesting to see that in the microinsurance, we have a coverage for droughts, for example, and in the macro, we don't. So we can use products that complement each other. Last year, we had payments to 31 families due to floodings and pests as well, and other factors. And this has generated for us one way to understand that we are able to support people like that, and we are seeking ways to increase this, talking with governments to consider this to be implemented in the municipal or meso level. And now to conclude quickly, the lessons learned. First, I think that it's very clear to us that governments are involved because governments know, they are the ones who know better the risks and vulnerabilities of each region. So it's very important that everything that we do is done together with governments and that strategies are developed also with the government. We don't have one size fits all tool for everything, so we work with different formulas. We also need to implement contingency credits, and we have other tools that are not only insurance that the government should or could manage. Also, doing this development by phases is very important. And it's important because there's no single event or tool. Just like we say that insurance is not the solution for climate change, insurance can promote change, promote more sustainable ways of management of farming or access to credit, but insurance is not the solution, we know. And generation of or evidence, because it's very difficult when you talk about a macro project. It's more difficult to know, for example, gender-related issues, to know how many men or women were supported. But since we work with social protection, we created this bridge because the governments are very worried or concerned with data generation. On the other hand, in microinsurance, we always have this awareness and we seek gender equality. In the next slide, I'll leave here some links to relevant publications about this, about the region. I think you're going to receive this material later. Here you have links to that you can visit. And here it's by country, different programs and strategies. If you'd like to access more information, they are all available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that extremely informative presentation, Leticia. Indeed, it was fascinating to hear the WFP macro approach mapped out and how insurance is indeed a crucial tool in ensuring resilience. Insurance in cases such as natural disasters requires a cross-sectoral collaboration and an active role of the government, especially to reach marginalized and impacted groups. And beyond just working with institutions, it seems that WFP's approach includes strengthening them to enhance overall responsive plans. So thank you so much for drawing attention to the multi-level response required to these types of events, such as tropical cyclone Julia, including social through meal provision, environmental, such as tree planting, and economic aspects. I think we can say that micro insurance is definitely very promising as an avenue for making coverage more available to low-income individuals or groups who face particular risks, such as crop failures. And insurance, as you have framed it, can also reduce the impacts of shocks and increase resilience, but should be tied with a broader approach that is context-specific, evidence-based, and builds the capacities of other critical actors. So thank you very much for these excellent points to take forward with our thinking on equitable disaster response. And speaking of evidence-based, we're now moving on to our next portion of the presentation, which will focus on the data pillar. And for this pillar, we ask the question, how does collecting and analyzing sex-aggregated data inform the different impacts of risks and disasters while highlighting their specific needs and vulnerabilities? And our next expert who will be answering this question is Jennifer Phillips. Jennifer works as an advisor for the Insure Resilience Global Partnership and leads the Insure Resilience Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions, which works to help guide practitioners and policymakers on developing innovative, inclusive, gender-responsive, and transformative quality, climate, and disaster risk financing and insurance solutions. Before joining IGP, she worked as a project manager at the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which is hosted by the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security in Bonn. In this role, she led UNU's contributions to the Pacific Insurance and Climate Adaptation Program, which is jointly implemented by the UN Capital Development Fund, UNDP, and UNU-EHS, as well as supporting the climate risk adaptation and insurance in the Caribbean project, which is jointly implemented by CCRIF SPC, formerly the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and ILO's Impact Insurance Facility. Previous to her position at MCII, she worked in advancing climate risk insurance Plus team at GIZ, and she holds an MA in Development Economics from the University of Göttingen and a BA in International Relations and Economics from James Madison College at Michigan State University. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, everyone, and I'm very happy to speak with you about this topic. So basically, to provide a bit of background, I always like to start with some of my own personal interests in this topic of working on gender and sex disaggregated data. So as you know from my background, I previously worked on projects on implementing climate risk insurance programs in different regions. And one of the first projects that I worked on was developing a type of parametric insurance product that would pay out after tropical cyclones to individuals so that they could quickly start recovering. And from our perspective there, we know that tropical cyclones and hurricanes don't specifically target any one gender, and our products were open for everyone, right? So we didn't see the need to adopt a very gender-specific approach. But what we quickly found out after the first couple of months of implementation was that our products were primarily only reaching a male audience and that women were not able to benefit from these products at all. And it clearly highlighted that just because natural disasters and hazards do not target any specific group, because of these big differences in terms of who has access to different distribution channels, who is part of a network or a cooperative, who's able to travel into the city to find out more about these programs, they all have a very major role in how people are able to benefit from these different climate and disaster risk financing and insurance products. And so the reason why it's so important to collect this sex disaggregated data is because it then allows us to better understand these different gender needs and disparities that exist in terms of who's able to actually purchase a product, who's able to use a savings account, who's able to take out credit, which all then have a major impact on how people are able to recover after these life-changing events. And so with that, we want to highlight in the work that we're doing as part of the Center of Excellence for Gender Smart Solutions, what exactly are these barriers that women and other genders face, and how can using sex disaggregated data help us to understand these barriers better and how to overcome them in our policymaking and our projects. And so we know that very often in many countries, there's a difference in terms of expectations and gender roles. Women often have to take on a larger role of taking care of children, as well as elderly members of their families and communities. This can really restrict them when it comes to being able to access different financial instruments because they won't be able to leave the home as often to go into the city to purchase them. They might not have the opportunity to join a cooperative because of these responsibilities to find out about the products or to attend a local community meeting. And so we need to think about different ways in which we can reach women when we find out more through collecting this data, what exactly their specific restrictions are. We also know this data is important when analyzing who has access to different property rights, because this can have a large implication on who's able to access credit types of products. We also need to understand what type of work women are engaged in order to understand how different types of risk will affect them in the long run. And so by very carefully mapping this through the use of sex disaggregated data, where we see how men's occupations, educations, and roles in society differ from women, we can then much more easily identify what we need to do as policymakers and implementers to reach women and overcome these barriers. And so one point to highlight here is the importance of capturing the sex disaggregated data in terms of education. We know that education is very key to raising awareness on natural hazards and what the best methods are for dealing and managing the impacts of these different climate events. We also know education can play a big role in people's ability to participate in the political discourse, because education is often key then to economic advancement and getting other opportunities for jobs that are more government and policy orientated. Understanding how these educational differences is important to seeing who has a voice in the society and who can bring in these perspectives to vocalize how things need to change. And also education is very important in ensuring that people understand what and how these different financial instruments work. In order for anyone to make a decision on what type of financial instrument they should be using, whether that's savings or credit or insurance, they need to understand what are interest rates, what's the insurance premium. Does it make sense for me to wait to take out credit if my interest on that credit is going to be 30%, 40%, or does taking out an insurance with a risk premium of 10% more economical for my financial well-being? And so all of these things can have a major impact in who's able to understand and access and be able to evaluate which type of CDRFI instrument they should be using. Additionally, it's very, very important to highlight and capture the sex disaggregated data in terms of employment. We talk a lot about how these increasing number of natural hazards are going to continue affecting people, but it's very rarely highlighted that it's in many countries the case that women work even more heavily in the agricultural sector, and so they are by far the group that's more impacted by these different types of events. And so with this question on employment, we have to see not only what sector people are working in, but in what conditions. You might be working as a farmer, but there's a big difference between working on one smaller scale around your household versus working as part of a major association or cooperative, because through a larger network, you're able to access more resources, more knowledge, and potentially more credit or instruments that could help benefit you after a disaster. And if you're working on this in this sector in a much smaller scale without these networks, it's going to be much harder for you then to access the type of support that you need. Additional to this is to think about how, depending on the role that the person plays in a value chain, for example, in some countries and communities, you find men will work more in the field and women will work more with selling the produce and the harvest and the markets. They could be impacted by these events very differently, right? So men may not worry as much in this particular case about extreme rainfall if they're growing on hillsides where they have proper drainage systems, but women might be much more heavily affected if the heavy rain then affects their ability to travel on the road and to go to the market to sell their products, right? And so we really have to understand the differences that each gender experiences with the different types of hazards that exist. And as a final point here, another thing that we really need to consider is that whenever working on these financial topics, there's always the potential that these would have negative consequences in the society, depending on how they're introduced. For example, through potentially increasing gender-based violence within the community. If there's a program that's implemented that's specifically targeted women where men feel excluded or where they feel that the women are benefiting more, there needs to be a better communication here in terms of making sure that no one gender feels that they're being punished or excluded from the project themselves, in order to ensure that we're not actually increasing harm within the community. And so with that, I would like to quickly summarize and say that there is, of course, quite a number of challenges and gaps. There's often a lack of data availability in many countries, or the quality is not what we would like to see, depending on the questions that are being asked and the information that's being collected. The accessibility can also be an issue depending on who's collecting that data, as well as often the intersectionality is neglected. So thinking not only about how just women are affected, but different minority groups within the community, different age groups within the community, all have a big impact on how severely they're affected. But as we see in the comic here, even though many want to focus on trying to quickly rebuild after any type of climate event, by building up the economy and getting the infrastructure down, gender cannot be neglected because it's so key to making sure that a quick recovery occurs and that certain members of the society are not left behind and left behind for years then because of the lack of targeted action. And so with that, just to highlight, there are quite a number of resources available online to talk about how to better collect sex disaggregated data that can really help you then in determining what type of programming your government would want to work on and how to structure this in a way that you can monitor how the different projects are affecting different groups within the society, as well as on our website with the Center of Excellence, we have a list of different types of resources. So with that, I'll summarize, the overall message from my presentation, that by taking this extra step, you will make all of your programming much more effective and much more efficient and much more impactful for all of the community members by capturing this information. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for enlightening us about the importance of data. It was truly fascinating to hear about how products such as insurance aimed at disaster relief often fail to reach women and are predominantly accessed by a male audience. And as you alluded to, we need to be more holistic and systematic approaching and designing these products so that they are truly accessible. However, to do this, data is crucial, especially when taking into account aspects such as gender-based roles, mobility, access to networks or social capital, and distribution channels. And I'm sure that the audience has greatly appreciated this more systems-based view of barriers faced by women in accessing these products and in overall participation and the role of data in addressing these barriers. So, for example, by understanding disparities through which women may have access to especially precarious housing and differing levels of access to education and financial literacy. And as you mentioned, data availability, quality, and access are key aspects that we need to collaboratively work to address in an equitable way across the globe. So with that being said, now it is time to address the last and final pillar, which is our directives pillar. And for this one, we ask the question, how can gender-sensitive policies and frameworks aid in promoting inclusivity? And our next speaker who will be answering this question is Catherine Miles. And Catherine is a gender consultant to the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership for Climate and Disaster Risk Finance and Insurance, CDRFI Solutions. Catherine has expertise and has written extensively on exploring and making the case for addressing the gender dimensions of CDRFI. She comes to the topic with a background in women's financial inclusion policy and regulation, and private sector development. And since 2018, she has supported Ensure Resilience and members of the Gender Working Group to identify and promote the integration of gender considerations in their CDRFI policies and solutions. Catherine began her career working for an insurance company, and she is now based in Oxford in the UK. And in her spare time, she serves as a city councillor. And we would also like to take this moment to thank Catherine for her support as the gender advisor for the ICLE Urban Infrastructure Insurance Facility Project, which was selected by the Ensure Resilience Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions Technical Advisory Facility to receive guidance and advice on implementing gender considerations into very important products for the project. But we will, of course, hear more about that later from Isadora. But until then, we would like to now invite Catherine to present on how gender-sensitive policies and frameworks in local governments can aid in promoting inclusivity. Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My pleasure. So climate and disaster risk financing policies can address gender differences in people's vulnerability and protection needs to climate-related disasters, and this can improve outcomes for all people. But how? So I'd like to focus on what we mean by these policies, why they're important, and then policy entry points for how they can be gender sensitive. Next slide, please. So when we refer to CDRFI policies or CDRF policies, we're referring to a broad range of policies that incorporate and inform CDRFI instruments. Now, these policies include disaster risk financing strategies, climate change policies, national adaptation plans or NAPs, social protection policies, amongst others. And these policies may specifically also govern a risk pool where governments and local government may be a policyholder. So if gender sensitive, these policies intentionally acknowledge the social, behavioural and cultural attributes and norms and opportunities associated with being female or male, and address the implications of these for climate and disaster risks and protection needs. And this is both in the policy content and also in the process of developing policies and implementing them, including in monitoring and evaluation, or what's referred to as M&E. Next slide, please. So why is it important for these policies to be gender sensitive? Well, policy content and the policy making process are influenced by and influence social norms. We've been hearing about that in the previous presentations. It's a two-way thing. Now, policy content needs to include an explicit recognition of and account for the gender-related context in which these policies are developed and implemented. And to be inclusive, these policies should acknowledge and address other factors that intersect with gender, such as age, ethnicity, or geography, which can also have implications for an individual's risk profile and their needs. Ignoring the impact of gender dynamics in this gender context can really reinforce or exacerbate existing power differentials between men and women, with negative implications on vulnerabilities and exposure to climate and disaster risk. And it also can restrict resilience building opportunities. So there's really an imperative to implement gender sensitive policy approaches. Next slide, please. But also, this sort of approach can support the delivery of international climate change, disaster risk reduction, and gender equality and women's empowerment commitments. I've just listed a few here on the screen, and these get implemented both in national commitments and at a local level as well in policy. So there's really a policy and imperative there from that direction too. Next slide, please. I'd like to now give a few illustrative examples of how practical policy action can be taken. And I'm going to focus mainly on this particular slide here and this entry point. And that's the content of the CDRFI or CDRF related strategies, plans and budgets. And as mentioned earlier, this can include the policies that determine how governments use and track the impact of payouts from their risk financing instruments. Now, within the policy content, there are various opportunities to consider gender. And one is in terms of a policy analysis from a gender perspective, recognizing these gender differential impacts of disasters or structural gender inequalities, which can inform your policies and strategies. And we've heard of some of the data examples that Jennifer's just mentioned in her previous presentation. Just to give you an example, the Caribbean Development Bank this year has published a diagnostic report on gender-sensitive disaster risk financing instruments for resilience building. So there are examples of this happening within the region. Another example within this entry point is the use of vulnerability data, including data on gender in risk modelling. Now, there's a multilateral organisation in the region that's working on a vulnerability index to inform its risk financing work in a country in the Caribbean. So this is starting to be used, and it is really a critical policy element. To make that decision, you will use that vulnerability data. There's also an opportunity to use gender considerations and use them to inform contingency plans and draw on the data we've just heard about to inform payout priorities and budget allocation. And that can be for pre-disaster preparedness, budget reallocation during disasters, and also post-disaster budget fund allocation. Now, for example, policies can define that insurance payouts to councils will support infrastructure that addresses gender differential needs or risks that maybe relate to gender-specific reproductive health needs, or address gender-based violence, or looks at the unpaid care burden and childcare infrastructure. Budgets can also be allocated in a way that it provides for transportation infrastructure that account for gender differences in patterns of use of transport, because we know that women's mobility behaviour differs greatly from that of men. And there's some really important work going on in the region that can be drawn on to inform this. The IDB has a transport gender lab, and there's a network of cities, including Bogota and Buenos Aires, who are engaged in this. So there are opportunities there. The other element within the content of policies is including women-targeted approaches. For instance, in regulation, in insurance regulation and policy, we know in Argentina, the insurance supervisor has collaborated with industry to increase awareness and create new products and improve distribution strategies for insurance targeting women. And also we know that there is a need to design these insurance products for different target groups. And based on lessons from the climate risk and adaptation and insurance in the Caribbean project that was linked to MCII previously mentioned. So in the policy content, there are many opportunities to integrate gender. And another is in terms of sex disaggregated beneficiary targets. We've talked about data already. And in national disaster risk reduction strategies, and in Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, and Paraguay, they have all incorporated sex disaggregated indicators. So it's possible. And also we know that insurance supervisors in the region collect disaggregated insurance data, so that can inform your policies. And examples are in Costa Rica, Haiti, Chile, and Mexico, amongst others. And there are also insurance providers and the intermediaries that are collecting this data and setting beneficiary targets, such as Micro, which provides insurance products in Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, and Mexico. Another policy entry point related to this content is around the collection of gender and sex disaggregated monitoring and evaluation payout data. And that really can be useful because it can help you track who gets what in a climate disaster and who ultimately benefits or doesn't. And we know that this is something that the World Food Programme, who Letitia has been speaking on behalf of, does in the region in its approach to post-distribution monitoring. And it collects sex disaggregated household data on access and usage of payouts, changes in decision-making power, and access and control of resources by gender. I'd like to move on to the next slide, please. On the next slide, I want to just focus very briefly on the fact that there's an entry point in creating institutional mechanisms that coordinate and collaborate policymakers on gender equality and CDRFI related policies to ensure that there's coherence in these strategies with any national gender strategies. Chile is an example of a country in the region which has a Ministry of Women and Gender Equality, and it's established a system of coordination between different policy areas with great success to ensure that the public sector incorporates a gender focus when planning, budgeting, implementing and monitoring public policies. I'd like to move on to the next slide, please. And this is another entry point that you can think of, and this is around the participation of women in both the development of risk financing policies and instruments. And this is because quite often women can be underrepresented in these roles, both in terms of who is consulted and in the development of policies, but also who is making the policies as the civil servants, as the politicians. So policy actions can include analysis of baseline data on women's leadership and gender diversity in workforce participation in these different entities. It can involve setting targets on the proportion of women in leadership and workforce in these entities and support initiatives to promote women's networking and women's leadership in these areas. Now, Women's World Banking is an example of an organization that has a leadership and diversity program for regulators, and it's been working with insurance supervisors with support from A2II and the Insure Resilience Global Partnership on scholarships for insurance supervisors to build their leadership pipeline in regulatory organizations. So there are opportunities there. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the LAC Women's Disaster Risk Reduction Network, which is being created for and by women of Latin America and the Caribbean involved in disaster risk reduction. And that's bringing women together from the region involved in this area to support each other and inform policy making. So these are all examples that you could look at. So really just to conclude on the last slide, if you want to learn more, there's a toolkit that Insure Resilience has that focuses on this. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a link there where you can access that. And just to conclude with a final remark, which is incorporating these gender considerations into the policy development process and content can and will help protect lives and livelihoods by ensuring that all people will benefit from climate and disaster risk financing. So thank you.
Thank you for that insightful presentation, Catherine. And especially thank you for outlining the importance of gender-sensitive policy approaches and more broadly, other factors such as age, ethnicity, and geography. I really appreciated this point regarding how a blanket approach to assessing risk and creating policies accordingly does not give an accurate reflection of differing risk profiles and result in policies grounded in realities. As you mentioned, this definitely connects closely with the issue of data availability and quality. And overall, it is clear from your presentation that gender-smart CDRFI related strategies improve the overall quality of plans and policies and ultimately inform budget allocation that address the gender differential impacts of disasters. I also especially appreciated the policy entry points related to gender not being siloed, but rather integrated across different policy areas. And as a critical way to achieve this, the representation of women in leadership roles and policy making being very, very crucial. So thank you. And now we move on to our final speaker of the session, who will be presenting a snapshot example of a project implementing gender considerations in its work. ICLEI's own urban infrastructure insurance facility, the UIIF project, as mentioned earlier, has received guidance in integrating gender and CDRFI considerations through the technical advisory facility. And the UIIF project will be presented by none other than my own colleague, Isadora Bucella. And Isadora is the Regional Resilience Analyst at ICLEI, South America. She works in developing the analysis of climate risks and vulnerabilities for cities there, in addition to technical training and supporting local governments in adaptation actions by increasing their urban resilience. She's an architect and urban planner with a master's degree from the Federal University of Minas Gerais and a PhD student currently in architecture and urbanism at the University of Sao Paulo. She develops research on urban planning, green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, resilience, and adaptation for cities facing climate change. And now, Isadora, the floor is yours.
Muito obrigada, Nina.
Thank you, Nina. I'll speak in Portuguese. Today I have the pleasure to present the project that we are developing with or under the advisory of the Global Secretariat of ICLEI and through the Secretariats of South American, Mexican, and the Caribbean. So I will present the project Urban Infrastructure Insurance Facility. I'll speak a little bit briefly about ICLEI, I believe that you all know it, but it's always important to highlight for those who still want to get to know our network. I will talk a little bit about the context of Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll speak a little bit about the UIIF project and the cities that are with us in the project and the agenda, gender agenda that we are addressing. We have here a map where we show our offices. We have offices all around the world, and there's the World Secretariat where the management of the network is done. Here I'm speaking from the Office of South America, located in São Paulo, Brazil. And under our scope, we have the Colombia office, Argentina, and Brazil to address the topics of these countries and regions specifically. So speaking about ICLEI, it's a global network with more than 2,500 governments associated. We have basically 5 strategic paths, and these paths serve to guide the solutions that we offer to cities, which are the low carbon, based on nature-based, equitable and people-centered, resilient and circular. So these 5 paths guide the projects and products that we deliver to cities, and not only for governments, but also populations that live in these territories. Now, speaking a little bit about the disaster context in Latin America and South America, climate events we know that are going to be more frequent. We have high rates of urbanization, which worsen even more urban vulnerability and climate vulnerability. We have a limited availability of financial resources, and this amount of resources that is available is offered mainly for mitigation projects. So we see a challenge, which is to design and develop projects for adaptation and urban resilience to also attract banks and financing institutions for this topic. Now, speaking about the context of disaster for women, for this subgroup, I bring here some data. My colleagues also showed this information before, but just to highlight that women and girls account for 80% of the population that is displaced by disasters in the world. Women receive on average 21.3% less than men, and Black women receive a salary that is 55.6% lower than that of white men. We see a situation, it's a situation that we experience day to day, but when we observe the numbers, it's much more clear how different the context is from the perspective of men and women and within the different subgroups of the population. Women also face challenges related to poverty and the time that is dedicated, because they are a share of the population that usually spends more time taking care of the wounded and people in need. So we see the action of women, especially in vulnerable population, where a large part of the households are women-led. So this increases the challenge for this subgroup of the population. Now, to speak about the UIF project, we have a few objectives, which are basically to facilitate decision-making for risk and disaster in municipalities and to strengthen the financial resilience of cities. As outcomes, we seek to develop insurance products that are adapted to each city. We also seek to support the vulnerable population with emergency assistance, a facilitated rapid reconstruction of critical infrastructure services, and financial assistance. As I mentioned, the project is financed by KfW Development Bank and implemented by ICLEI through the Global Office and its South America and Caribbean offices. So the UIIF project, we are working with 10 cities, being 5 in Latin America and 5 in South America. We have around 7.5 million people that will be covered. This is an approximate number based on the cities that we are working with. More than 100 million euros are allocated for this project, and it will last until 2025. And to conclude, I just would like to highlight that the project was not originally developed with the gender agenda in consideration. This was something that was included this year. Since May, we've been doing some analysis of gaps that are present in the main products. We currently have a follow-up or monitoring by the Center of Excellence Ensure Resiliency through Catherine, the consultant, and it's a pleasure to have Catherine's support for this project. We're learning a lot in this path, and we are seeing the relevance of the importance of acquiring content and information about the gender agenda in relation to financing mechanisms and climate emergency. So we're having a very good experience in this project, UIIF, and it's something that we intend to apply in other projects of ICLEI. So this way I will conclude my talk. In the next slide, you can find the contact information for the South America office, and I thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Isadora, for providing an overview of the UIIF project and what is being done to integrate gender and CDRFI considerations. It's also wonderful to acknowledge that ICLEI intends to keep up this momentum and include other such considerations in future ICLEI activities and projects. It's also great to learn about this project, which includes collaboration with banks, cities and organizations like ICLEI. And it is also fantastic that the project had the flexibility to be adapted based off of results to include the gender aspect. And I'm very certain that this addition will greatly enhance the depth of outcomes from the project. And I also agree wholeheartedly that it should be included as an aspect in more projects by default moving forward. And with that, thank you so much for your presentation, Isadora. The next part of this section was originally going to be a Q&A, but unfortunately we have had such an interesting series of presentations today that we are not able to go forward with that planned Q&A. However, we would just like to say that your responses have been very much appreciated, and we thank you very much for your thoughtful contributions to this discussion. And with that, I believe it brings us now to the closing remarks. And for this, I would like to thank each and every one of you for being a part of this session today. It has been a truly inspiring session, and I hope that we take this information that we have learned today and apply it to making an additional positive difference in how we approach CDRFI. We would like to, of course, thank our invited speakers for being so generous and sharing their insightful presentations and ideas today. For Maria Eduarda, we would like to thank you for your inspiring presentation on Recife's Promover program and drawing attention to the crucial role of inclusive co-creation in such programs and incorporating gender aspects into KPIs to ensure their representation in significant programs such as this. And for Leticia, we thank you for your thoughtful presentation on the role of microinsurance in disaster relief for vulnerable groups and the importance of capacity building in implementing this approach. For Jennifer, we would like to thank you for your informative presentation on the critical role of data in gender smart resilience and how it can better help understand the barriers that women face in accessing insurance products and how these barriers could be addressed. For Catherine, we would like to thank you for your wonderful presentation on the directives pillar, and especially for outlining clear policy entry points that could help for the integration of gender perspectives into disaster responses. And for Isadora, we thank you for your enlightening presentation on the UIIF project regarding gender considerations being made and the importance of incorporating the gender perspective into projects to enhance the overall outcomes. And we would also like to take this moment to thank our interpreters for providing live interpretation in Spanish and Portuguese for this event, allowing for it to be accessible, inclusive to our broader audience. And we would like to thank our Daring Cities events team. They are the ones creating the magic behind the scenes. So a huge thank you to them for their support and to everyone else that made this event happen. In line with the upcoming Daring Cities events, it would be wonderful to see you all at the next one. Titled Forging Partnerships, Stakeholder-Driven Adaptation and Resilience Initiatives in Southeast Asian Cities. And it is taking place next week on the 22nd of August. And more information can be found in the chat box below. So do make sure to register for that. And finally, thank you to our audience for participating in this event and actively engaging in the Slido poll and for your questions as well, which unfortunately we were not able to get to today. And with that, I would like to thank you once again, and I am wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everyone.